the History Channel.
Travel back to ancient Rome, where absolute monarchs indulged in sins of flesh and gluttony. Discover the private lives and passions of the emperors who ruled the civilized world. Like much of the Roman Empire, the position of emperor was born in blood. When Rome's army began conquering the ancient world around 200 BC, there was no emperor. Rome was a republic with power in the hands of the Senate. But by about 50 BC, power was shifting to the generals who used their armies to further their own ambition. One commander, Julius Caesar, bludgeoned his rival generals into submission and became dictator for life in 45 BC. But within months, he was murdered by jealous noblemen, and the empire was plunged into civil war. When the dust had settled, two men were left to jointly run the empire. One was Julius Caesar's adopted son, Octavian. The other was Caesar's friend, Mark Antony. But Antony showed less interest in governing than in courting the alluring Queen of Egypt, Cleopatra. Antony's escapades made him unpopular in Rome, and Octavian used this excuse to declare war on Antony in a fight for total control of the empire. Octavian won. Antony and Cleopatra were forced to commit suicide. Octavian now had absolute power. He took the exalted name of Augustus and became the first emperor of Rome. But Augustus was determined to protect himself from the same jealousy that had put Caesar in his grave. He set out to win the hearts of Rome by presenting himself as a man of the people. He ordered a huge rebuilding program for the city. He would later boast that he'd found Rome a city of bricks and left it a city of marble. But he was very careful not to build a grand palace for himself. In keeping with his image, his house was nothing like the extravagant mansions later emperors would build. Augustus chose to live on the Roman hill where he'd been born, the Palatine, which was the legendary birthplace of Rome, where the city's founders, Romulus and Remus, were supposedly raised by a she-wolf. Many politicians had fine homes on the hill. The word palace itself comes from Palatine. But Augustus made sure that his house would be remarkable only for its modesty. His home was only average size, and his murals were standard for the time, no different from what any senator might have. Roman historians made special mention of how plain his house was. No fancy marble and no elaborate floor mosaics, just ordinary black and white tile. Augustus's humble image included a tactic that today's politicians would recognize. He preached family values. His clothes were all sewn by his wife and daughters, and his speeches urged strict moral behavior.
He's got a very specific reason for coming across as simple. He set himself up as the opposite of his rival Antony. Antony was notorious for his self-indulgence, for his pursuit of women, for his affair with Cleopatra, for his drunkenness, and so on and so forth.
But Augustus's own family failed to live up to the moral standards he preached. They had their own dark secrets. Augustus's own daughter, Julia, publicly disgraced him by holding orgies in the Roman Forum. Augustus banished her to a tiny island, but he himself was less than pure. Augustus was famous for his affairs, and even Antony had once scolded him for it.
Why do you object to my sleeping with Cleopatra? What about you? Does it really matter to you where or with whom you perform the sexual act? Letter from Mark Antony.
Whatever his morals, Augustus made the role of emperor a permanent one. By strengthening the empire and the army during his 44-year reign, he began a tradition of imperial rule that would last for 4 centuries. And yet his own life would end in a way he least suspected. Because he had no son of his own, he named his wife's son as heir. That was fatal. His wife, Livia, fed Augustus poisoned figs to help speed up her son's inheritance. After Augustus's death, the emperor's residence passed to his stepson, Tiberius. Like so many emperors to come, he had won the crown through a murder within the family. Tiberius, a professional soldier, was 54 years old, and unlike Augustus, he was never popular. He became so uncomfortable with politics that he turned his back on Rome and built his own palace on the island of Capri. The Capri villa, perched above the sea, was aloof and remote, like Tiberius himself. Away from the eyes of Rome, Tiberius could indulge himself without restriction. And, as with many emperors to come, one of the main indulgences was feasting. Imperial banquets could involve more than 1,000 guests and a dozen courses. Exotic ingredients were brought in from all over the empire. Dishes might include peacock brains and flamingo tongues. In the best preserved of the emperor's mansions, we can see how grand these banquets must have been. For example, Hadrian's villa near Rome had several dining halls, all intended to impress the visitor.
Of course, it doesn't look much like a dining room that we're used to. There were no such things as table and chairs for the upper classes, at least, to dine on. That what they had instead, they had couches. And here you see a semicircular couch. It would have been piled up with cushions, and the guests of Hadrian would have leant across and they would have reclined on those cushions, leaning on their left elbow, and they would have waited for their dinner to be served to them.
But for Tiberius, indulgences went far beyond feasting. His villa is said to have been decorated with pornography of all kinds, and he's alleged to have had young children brought to the village to perform for his pleasure. Boys who resisted his advances were said to have had their legs broken. Why did Tiberius and his successors behave so outrageously? The reason may have been political insecurity.
One way an emperor can overcome that sense of insecurity is acting secure. And there's nothing like debauchery for making a fine show of I'm in control, I'm ruling, I can do what the hell I want and I don't care what the rest of you say, you can't touch me.
Isolated on Capri, Tiberius gradually became bitter and cruel. Any perceived rival was tortured and thrown off the cliff top. Soldiers were waiting below to kill any survivors with boat hooks. The emperor's tyranny spread to Rome itself. Scores of political enemies were tried and executed on phony charges of treason. One senator was condemned for carrying a coin with Tiberius's face on it into a toilet. Tiberius became so widely hated that his own guards decided it was time to change emperors. They smothered him with his own pillow. His 25-year-old adopted grandson was named the new emperor to great public rejoicing. But that would soon change. The young man's name was Caligula.
To begin with, he's terrifically popular. He has the potential, when succeeding a bloody tyrant, to appear as the popular young hero. And he milks this for a few months. And it's as if his success went to his head.
Caligula ended the treason trials and began a public building program. He moved the imperial residence from Capri back to the Palatine mansion, which he expanded, but he found no comfort there. Having seen his mother and 2 brothers executed by Tiberius, he was racked by insomnia and horrific nightmares. He roamed the palace at night, ordering the sun to rise. Soon his own cruel streak emerged, fulfilling Tiberius's warning that he was raising a viper for the Roman people. At the games, where Caligula himself liked to race chariots, he was once informed there was not enough meat for the wild beasts. He pointed to a row of prisoners and had them chopped up into pet food. At the palace, he is said to have watched tortures while he was eating, and even had his own father-in-law executed for not showing him enough respect.
The palace becomes a place of terror. He has a young man executed, of course, in the presence of his father, and then he invites his father to dinner that evening and forces him to joke. He seizes the wives of his guests at his will. There are descriptions of him picking the most beautiful woman at the table, inviting her into a neighboring room, and then returning, she with her hair all disheveled, and him recounting her various merits to her husband and the diners around.
Caligula indulged every whim, and no one benefited more than his favorite racehorse. The emperor provided the horse with a marble stable, slaves, and joked that he was thinking of making the horse a consul of Rome. When Caligula's spending bankrupted the treasury, he raised money by opening a brothel within the palace itself, inviting all of Rome to come and make use of it. When Caligula declared himself a living god and replaced the heads of statues of the gods with his own, the Senate and the army decided they'd had enough. During a lunch break in the games, right in front of the palace, soldiers attacked with swords, stabbing him 30 times. Another tyrant was dead, and Rome breathed a sigh of relief. And yet the trail of Roman excess was not over. There would soon be an emperor who would plunge to even lower depths, and may have even destroyed the city of Rome itself. The Emperor Nero. Just outside the city of Naples lies a volcano called Vesuvius. In the year 79 AD, the top of this mountain exploded in a huge eruption, burying the entire city of Pompeii. But Pompeii was not the only victim. Nearby, below the suburban streets of Naples, lies a majestic villa that's only recently been uncovered after lying undisturbed beneath the ashes for nearly 2,000 years. It's believed the villa's owner may have been the Empress Poppaea, one of Nero's wives.
Here in front of us, we can actually see the material that buried the villa as a result of the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. We see on the lowest level here these volcanic pebbles, the layers of ash. Above that, a tremendous layer of volcanic mud which swept down the mountainside and completely covered the villa.
Unlike Pompeii, no one was buried alive at Poppaea's villa. Excavators have found no bodies, but the volcanic ash has preserved the villa in wonderful condition, giving us a rare glimpse of the luxury an emperor's family enjoyed in Roman times. Beneath its splendor, It offers testimony about the role of women in the emperor's families, a reminder that they could be just as ambitious and ruthless. Against this backdrop, Nero's wife hatched schemes and intrigues as breathtaking as the grand villa itself.
She was a woman of great beauty, she was a woman of great wealth, and a woman of intelligence and nobility. But it seems from the very beginning that wasn't enough for her. She wanted more. She wanted to fight her way right to the very top and to become empress of the Roman world, to marry Nero and to have the highest position that she could possibly have.
What was Poppeia's plan? First, she left her husband to become Nero's mistress. Then she persuaded Nero to marry her. But there she faced an obstacle. Nero was already married. So Poppaea had Nero exile his wife and then had her murdered. Poppaea had her rival's head brought to her on a platter as proof of her success. Poppaea became empress as she wished, but in the emperor's house, no one was safe. Even being pregnant with Nero's heir was no guarantee against his temper.
There is a suggestion that Nero came home late from the races one day, and Poppaea was outraged by this, accused him of coming home late, and that in a fit of rage, he kicked her to death. So clearly there were very great disadvantages to being empress.
It was not the only time Nero would murder an ambitious woman in his own family. He'd become emperor thanks to the ruthlessness of his mother, Agrippina. She had married the emperor Claudius, had talked him into making Nero his heir, and then had killed the emperor by poisoning his mushrooms. That made Nero emperor in 54 AD at the age of 16. A terrible new chapter in Rome's history was about to be written.
Nero spent his life so disgracefully that it is disgusting and shameful to record his existence, let alone that he ruled the world. Aurelius Victor, Roman historian.
At first, Nero was a popular and competent leader, but then ego and family pressures began to weigh upon him. His mother Agrippina sought to rule the empire through her son, and was even rumored to have seduced him to strengthen her hold. Nero rebelled and exiled her from the palace, but then he decided that was not enough.
Agrippina's death was carefully designed to look like an accident. A collapsible boat was invented, and there on the Bay of Naples, as she sailed across, the boat caved in on her. Alas, she survived. She swam to the shore with the aid of a trusty maid, and the news was sent to Nero, "You can rejoice, your mother has been saved." At this stage, Nero panics completely. He must kill her. She knows there's been an assassination attempt. He can't mess around any longer, and so he sends a man with a sword to murder her.
Nero, now 22 years old, allegedly inspected his mother's body while drinking a glass of wine and lifted each one of her limbs, commenting on their good and bad points. For years later, he complained of being haunted by her ghost. One of Nero's greatest passions was music. He thought of himself as a great singer and lyre player. He gave public concerts which went on for hours. The audience was forbidden to leave their seats, and women would feign childbirth or even death just to be carried outside. Nero's most famous musical performance is alleged to have come during the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, when most of central Rome was destroyed, including part of the imperial palace. Many Romans accused Nero of starting the blaze himself. So began the legend that Nero fiddled while Rome burned.
And they suggested that Nero deliberately burnt Rome and played his lyre as it burnt, singing the song of the sack of Troy, which indeed would have been very appropriate and was a song that he had famously composed just before the time of the fire.
Did Nero set fire to Rome? We can't know for sure, but he did have his motives. The destruction gave him the chance to hand out charity afterwards to improve his waning popularity. And the fire also cleared a space for him to build an enormous new palace. This was his famous Golden House, a mansion that spread right across central Rome and was big enough to contain a statue of Nero 120 feet high. It had corridors a mile long, and its hundreds of rooms contained unprecedented luxury.
There was a famous room that imitated the heavens with stars on a dome that circulated throughout the dinner, and the guests would watch the heavens circling, and then they would be sprayed with perfumes, and there would be rose petals floating down as they dined.
Nero said of his new palace, "At last I am being housed like a human being." But the mansion, surrounded by huge private forests, lakes, and vineyards, appalled many Romans. It became so unpopular that Nero looked for a scapegoat for the fire that had made it possible. He blamed a new religious sect in Rome, the Christians. Hundreds were crucified or torn to death by animals, or even burned alive at night to serve as lamps. One of the dead is said to have been St. Peter the Apostle, victim of the collision between religion and the power politics of Rome. Despite his scapegoating, Nero's popularity continued to slide. He'd had no great victories on the battlefield, and his extravagance was emptying the imperial purse.
Nero had an idea that people should just throw their money around, and he did. So he spent. And in fact, this is part of his undoing, that he was unable to pay the army and other people toward the end.
The army began to revolt, and the mood spread. One night, Nero awoke in his giant palace to find himself alone. He'd been deserted by his bodyguards and all but a few of his servants. Panic-stricken, he ran through the palace shouting, "Are there no friends or enemies left?" Finally, he dashed barefoot out into the street. Former slaves took him to a country house to hide, but Nero soon learned that the Senate had sentenced him to be flogged to death. As soldiers approached, he sobbed, "What a great artist the world is losing," and stabbed himself in the neck. He was 30 years old. Later emperors did their best to eradicate Nero's memory. The Golden Palace was torn down, and on the site of his private lake, a public stadium was built, the Colosseum. The limitless indulgence of the emperors was made possible by the richness of the Roman Empire. Having conquered most of the Western world, the emperors plundered their colonies for the best food, wine, marble, and slaves. In the emperor's mansions, slaves were numbered in the hundreds, most of them spoils of war forcibly taken from conquered lands.
They came at a young age. The average life expectancy of a slave might only be about 25. So you bought them at 8 or so, and the first use of a slave in a house is literally as a boy, as a girl, to help with things, but also if they're pretty boys and pretty girls, they act as their masters' or mistresses' sexual favorites.
Slaves could be terribly treated. A story is told of a slave being hauled off to be fed to the eels because he broke expensive dinnerware. Yet other slaves were so trusted by the emperor that they were made ministers of state. Slaves were confined to their own areas within an emperor's mansion, a separation of the social orders still visible at Poppaea's well-preserved villa near Vesuvius.
This courtyard seems to have been reserved especially for the slaves. What tells us that is this decoration, this very crude, stripy decoration, which forms a deliberate contrast, which the master himself must have wanted us all to see, a contrast to the beautiful decoration in the private rooms. It tells the visitors, keep out, this is a slave quarter. But if it's a slave quarter, it's a slave quarter for rather pampered slaves, because inside they've got a lovely garden. This area was full of fruit trees, a fountain, statues, even a sundial. The garden is dominated by a massive shrine. This is almost certainly a shrine for the worship of the household gods, in particular for the worship of the spirit of the master and mistress of the house. The slaves were strongly discouraged from normal forms of religion. Romans were actually quite nervous because slave revolts often focused on religious worship. They therefore encouraged their slaves to worship the master and mistress.
The belief in gods, omens, and superstitions was shared by slaves and emperors alike. Ancient writers say that nearly every emperor was scared of thunder and lightning, which could signal the death of rulers. At the Emperor Hadrian's villa, it is believed he used his empty theater for staging ceremonies of mysterious cults which dealt with death and rebirth. The performances were aimed at terrifying the audience so that they were better prepared for their ultimate fate. In the same way, Hadrian created what he called an underground, a possible recreation of hell where he and his guests could experience the feeling of the afterlife in advance. But of all the emperors, none was more superstitious than Domitian, who came to power in 81 AD. Early in life, astrologers had foretold the exact hour and date of his death, and Domitian led the rest of his life in paranoia and insecurity. He already had an inferiority complex because his father, Vespasian, and brother Titus had both been great soldiers and popular emperors. Domitian was also worried about his looks. He was balding rapidly, despite what his official statutes suggested. He wrote a book called The Care of the Hair, in which he said, "How pleasant it is to have good looks, yet how quickly that time passes." How could he overcome his feelings of inadequacy? One way was to build an enormous new palace on Rome's Palatine Hill, described as greater than the pyramids.
There was nothing quite like it in the Mediterranean world at that time. This was something incredible that never had been achieved in Greece before, which the Romans often looked to Greece, but we have nothing on this kind of scale or this complexity.
An enormous palace tells you about a guy who's trying to look really big. And Domitian, he stood in the shadow of the past, of all the great achievements of the emperors before him, including his own father and his own brother. And Domitian's problem was that the public wouldn't buy him. They wouldn't believe that he was as big as he wanted to be. And everything he did was felt to be a fake. He wasn't even any good at doing the office work. What they said was, Domitian isn't there busy doing his paperwork. He's sitting there stabbing flies. And the joke went around. Is Domitian busy? Is there anyone with him? Not even a fly.
So fearful was Domitian of assassination that he had his palace filled with shining marble so that he could see the reflection of anyone approaching him from behind. And his paranoia made him cruel. he had hundreds executed in the name of public morals. When Vestal virgins were found guilty of adultery, he had them buried alive and their lovers beaten to death in the Forum. Domitian, like other emperors before him, directed his reign of terror at the senators, executing many of them. The Senate had once ruled Rome and was jealous of imperial power.
They still had some hope or belief that they still might return and be a strong force. And they collected assiduously all of the gossip and all of the dirt that they could get and circulate on the emperors.
As the predicted day of his death, September 18th, 96 AD, approached, Domitian's nervousness reached fever pitch, especially when his palace was struck by lightning. Inside the palace itself, his murder was being planned by his servants and his wife, who feared they might be next on Domitian's death list. They knew that Domitian would not relax until the predicted hour of his death, midday, had passed.
He paces nervously up and down the corridors of the palace, asking the time. And he is told, midday has just passed. He breathes a sigh of relief and sets off for the bathroom. There a messenger reaches him, saying there's urgent news of an assassination attempt. He goes to his bedroom, and in his bedroom he's reached by the messenger. And it's the messenger who is, of course, the assassin, and stabs him once. Domitian doesn't die easily. He goes to his bed. Under the pillow, he has a dagger. He seizes it and discovers there's no blade. He still won't give up. He struggles with the man, protecting himself with his fingers, which are slashed. But even though his fingers are slashed, he tries to gouge out the eyes of the assassin. And it takes many blows before the tyrant is finally killed.
Domitian's body was carried from his massive palace on the predicted day. His paranoia and the astrologer had both been proven right. Of all the emperors who built great mansions to reflect their own glory, none surpassed the extravagance of Hadrian, who became emperor in 117 AD. His private villa at Tivoli, near Rome, was built on a staggering scale. It occupied 300 acres, making it twice as big as the entire city of Pompeii. It had about 900 rooms, plus theaters, libraries, baths, banquet halls, and even an artificial island where Hadrian could go to retreat from the pressures of being emperor.
It seems to me that Hadrian was the sort of man who must have said, one day when I'm emperor, I am going to build the largest villa and I'm going to create my own buildings. I think it's a combination of an enormous ego with a tremendous passion for architecture, which Hadrian clearly had.
What drove Hadrian and most of the emperors to build on such a massive scale? Hadrian had already ordered his soldiers in Britain to build the greatest defensive barrier the Western world had ever seen. Hadrian's Wall, running more than 70 miles from sea to sea. In Rome itself, Hadrian personally directed dozens of building projects, including the restoration of the Pantheon.
All the emperors are profoundly concerned with building, because putting up buildings is the most conspicuous way to say, I am here now and I'm in control and you can't get round me.
Hadrian's villa was so huge that it took 1,000 soldiers just to guard the perimeter. It took 20 tons of food each month to feed them, and another 100 tons for their horses. And those bills were only a fraction of the expense run up by Hadrian, his staff of hundreds, and his many guests. One example of the luxurious scale of the villa is the enormous bathhouse.
We can imagine the Emperor Hadrian coming into these baths with some of his friends for an afternoon of luxury, relaxation, and bathing. They would have come with their slaves, who would have brought garments with them, who would have brought the implements for the bathing. They would have come in, taken off their clothes, moved into a room such as this one here, which was probably a steam room where they could have sat around, relaxed, have a rub down with oil, get their slaves to scrape their skins with a scraper, and then move out into this room here and take a cold bath in the plunge pools that we see on the two sides of the room.
Although Hadrian was a great planner of buildings, he could not run his private life according to plan. He had married a well-connected noblewoman named Sabina, but almost from the start, they were cold and distant toward each other.
She was a very difficult woman, very moody, and if he had been a private citizen, he certainly would have divorced her. However, it was a political marriage, and so it was important for Hadrian not only to marry her at the beginning, but to remain married to her.
Hadrian is said to have tried to poison Sabina for refusing to give him children. But there may have been another reason Hadrian had no heir. Hadrian's famous love was not his wife, but a teenage boy named Antinous, the emperor's constant escort. In the Roman world, such a relationship was not unusual.
They assume that love for boys is part of love for beautiful things, love for the human body. Hadrian is said to have had affairs with boys and with married women. And the same story is told about Roman emperor after Roman emperor.
This reflecting pool at the villa may have been built as a monument to the emperor's young lover. The pool decor has an Egyptian theme, and it was in Egypt that Hadrian's love affair with Antinous ended in tragedy. The two had been traveling in the Middle East, and in Libya, Hadrian boasted that he killed a lion with his bare hands to save Antinous. But soon afterwards, while sailing down the Nile with Hadrian, Antinous fell overboard and drowned.
According to some stories, he was pushed. Indeed, he was sacrificed in some special rite which would prolong Hadrian's own life by killing a young boy and getting all the power of the young boy into himself. What is certain is that he made an enormous fuss about the death of Antinous, and after his death, the Roman world fills up with statues celebrating Antinous. There is a cult of Antinous. He found cities named after Antinous. So he really wants to display to everyone the importance of his homosexual relationship with young Antinous.
Although the image of Antinous became famous throughout the empire, his grave has never been found. Some archaeologists have speculated that he may be buried somewhere near the pool itself, because statues of Greek maidens bearing fruit were often used in tombs. But excavation has so far failed to reveal any trace of the young man who captivated an emperor. Hadrian himself outlived Antinous by only 8 years. He was 62 when he died in the year 138 AD. He had given the empire 20 years of stable government, secure borders, and a wealth of glorious buildings. The Roman system of imperial government would last for another 300 years, until the empire was overrun by barbarian tribes like the Vandals and the Huns. As the empire dissolved, so did the emperor's mansions, through pillaging and neglect. Many were buried by centuries of earth until the Renaissance, when they were looted again for their treasure.
The Renaissance, when people were building the palaces and great churches of Rome, they would come, dig tunnels, and go underground trying to recover marble and all these resources. So these were like the second Vandals in a certain sense, coming back to the city.
The monuments and ruins of the empire are with us still, silent witnesses to Roman grandeur and Roman decay. The wealth and power that supported the empire's excesses could not save it from collapse. A potent lesson that gives us pause on our journey in search of history.